The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, someone who has read and loved these books for a long time, and I am joined by Greg, who has read a little bit of these books and probably likes them some. Greg, how are things going?
You're definitely overestimating my enthusiasm. No, I'm good. It's good to be back. Again, we don't always tip our hands, but it's been a little while. We're recording a little late, so if it's funny how a couple days early or a couple days late just makes the 1 week seem like very long or very short. And this one was a long stretch. So good to be back and talking a little Wheel of Time. I will say, separate from you and including you, I've had a couple of conversations lately about the show. So I know that enthusiasm is building for the show to come back in who knows how long. Still a mystery when season 2 will debut as we record this, but it seems like people are getting a little more enthusiastic for it.
Yeah, and I will just use this as an opportunity to plug, probably between the second and third book, we are going to be dropping a few episodes in which we and probably some friends review the first season and talk about some of the differences and similarities to the book. So if you are excited, along with all of Greg's friends, apparently, absolutely, this is a good time to continue diving in, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more content that really suits that. Is there anything else you have before we dive into what I am excited in ill-advised discussion of visual media?
Let's do it.
Excellent. So I'm going to say the name again because that's how this works. We have an ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast. This week, the icon of chapter 29, Seanchan. And this icon, it is the insectoid helmet that we have described a few times that Seanchan soldiers wear. And as usual, I want you to take the first pass at this because I obviously know a little bit more about the world building than we've gotten in one chapter. But what was your impression first on seeing this image without any context? And then obviously the chapter kind of puts at least a little bit of context on it. What were your thoughts here?
Very immediate first impression is just dark, right? Like this is one where the bulk of the image that seems to matter is portrayed in heavy black with thin white lines to give it its shape and form. And then second reaction is like, it's weird. It's a strange little helmet design here, and I think it's only natural when you get a helmet like this to be thinking of every other knight helmet and, properties in fantasy. And so thinking of it that way, it's certainly unique. I can trace maybe some influences on it, but I would say it doesn't immediately bring to mind really anything from elsewhere in the fantasy realm.
Yeah, the closest I could get is the rear part of the helmet feels a little bit like Eastern, maybe Chinese. The front of the helmet almost looks like a plague doctor mask to me, but combining those two elements, as you say, I can't think of anyone else who has even come close to that. The first two words that I had in my notes seemingly were identical to yours, dark and weird, which I then followed up with alien insectoid plague doctor ick. That is the full extent of my notes on this image.
Well, and I think I have some idea about this culture, and as always, I think you're gonna have to fill in my memory on clues we've gotten about them before. But I think the two influences there, it's kind of Eastern and Oceanic, right?
Yeah.
That we have very much a samurai style helmet. It also brings to mind Darth Vader. It's the essential shape of his helmet, which is inspired by samurai helmets, but the ornate kind of dressing on the top of it makes me think of like Pirates of the Caribbean or something with, you know, the Kraken, or even just Davy Jones with his squid face. So both of those look like squid arms, squid tentacles. There's the word I was looking for. Maybe not with suckers, but that kind of design, and just kind of the waviness around it makes me think, yeah, actually, I would say less alien in my opinion and more oceanic, is kind of my reaction.
Interesting. No, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would honestly just say I think that those two things can often be the same thing. If you have ever seen footage from the bottom of the ocean, that stuff is alien. The other thing that I think is really interesting here is you're, I think, doing a really good job of pulling out kind of the real world influences on this image. But there's also just something to be said for the in-world story of the Seanchan doing everything they can to make their soldiers look monstrous and inhuman. And I think that is something that we can also take away from this. This, I think you're right, is an image that intersects with our world quite a bit. But it also tells us a lot about this culture that, as you say, we only have a little bit of insight into at this point. And it's helpful to understand they kind of don't mind being seen as monsters sometimes. So that's what I've got on this image. Any last thoughts before we dive into the chapters proper?
No, I mean, I guess the last thought is just building off of what you just said is I'm now picturing like an army of these things approaching me or approaching our characters. And it's like, yeah, that would amplify the effect, you know, very much the opposite of like stormtroopers. Stormtroopers are scary because they're all the same and there's just a ton of them. Whereas this is like, no, we're going to make each one so scary that you're not going to forget the individual, even if there is a mass of them. So interesting and curious, but I don't want to talk about them yet. I think we first need to talk about chapter 29, or nope, 28, which is our first chapter tonight, which is not Seanchan, but is in fact a new thread in the pattern. Hit me with the dulcet tones of your sweet, sweet summary.
No, that horrifies me. I will just give you the summary. So Perrin begins by leading the group of soldiers and Varen through the mountains. The wolves are basically ignoring everything that isn't Trollocs, and so when Ingtar starts asking him questions, he doesn't have a lot of great answers about anything other than Trollocs. Perrin notices that Varen has been like super aloof and assumes she's thinking about Rand, and then also starts thinking about like wolf memories. And it actually seems for the first time that he is working to shut those wolf voices out, as opposed to before, where it seems like he had to kind of work to let them in. Ingtar begins asking Perrin to kind of explain everything that's happened so far, and we learn for the first time that the wolves observed that the horn had been taken, and they say that someone called Shadow Killer killed a number of Trollocs and then fled with the horn of Valir. Ingtar is or at this point, we sort of immediately have Uno shout out and say there's an Aiel in the rocks. Ingtar is shocked that there is an Aiel that far from the waist, but very soon an individual matching the description gets up. Matt immediately says, oh my god, that guy looks like Rand, and we are then introduced to the Aiel Urian. So he initially basically says, I'm willing to dance, and we learn that that means he's ready to murder them all. And then he begins asking a number of questions, first of Varen, because he says that she has the same ageless look as the wise ones, and then he starts asking all of them about what he is searching for, what he says is the prophecy of he who comes with the dawn, the prophesied hero of the Aiel. And when asked what he is looking for, he basically just says, well, I'll know it when I see it. At this point, Varen is clearly very interested in the fact that wise ones seem to have at least something in common with Aes Sedai, and so she starts asking him about Ruidian, the city that he says the wise ones go to. She starts asking him about a variety of things, and he gives some really vague answers, right? People go and are marked, and only the wise ones and the clan chiefs go, but that's about all that we get out of him. Urian basically at the end of this chapter says, look, if you don't have anything for me, I'm out. And since they can't help him find he who comes with the dawn, he's not able to really give them any additional information. The one thing that we do learn as we are leaving is that both Matt and Perrin seem convinced that he who comes with the dawn is also Rand. And I think that is interesting from a character perspective, because I didn't assume that at all the first time I read it. So this is a very brief chapter, but I was shocked. It took up almost as much space in my notes as the much longer chapter that came after it. So I'm curious what your impression was. I found this to be a really dense and interesting chapter, but I think those can also sometimes be hard to read. So what was your takeaway as a first-time reader?
I mean, honestly, what I thought the most was Shadow Killer. Qu'est-ce que c'est? Ba, 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 ba. I just was singing that to myself all after. You have no idea what I'm saying. Psycho
No
Killer?
clue whatsoever.
Oh, okay. All right. Find Psycho Killer, the song, well, a classic song. So I was singing Shadow Killer in my head all the time. Let's see. It was dense. And I think to me, my reading definitely just focused on the fact that we peeled back another layer on these cultures, and it's like, okay, we are drawing in now these Aiel, who we've heard a lot about, that we tie to Rand because everybody thinks he's Aiel, and it's like yet another piece that's coming. And really, and this, and then the next chapter, I think I would classify much the same way. And it really felt to me like when I read Game of Thrones, and it's like I would be worried about some little conflict, and then it's like, oh, plus the Iron Fleet is coming, plus Daenerys, plus the White Walkers, and it's like there are these layers of threats that I don't know that these are necessarily threats, but it's like layers of mythology where it's like, oh, well, I'm really interested in what's happening with Matt and Perrin, and will they get the horn in time to save Matt? But then I'm also interested in Rand being the chosen one. And then now we're adding the Aiel, and now we're adding this. And, honestly, I think that's what early books in a series should do. I mean, if you want to be a really long series, you need a lot of stuff to work through. And, again, thinking of Game of Thrones, and this is probably unfair, you just wonder if the series can deliver on it then, right? Like, oh, okay, get me super invested in this. And, famously, the showrunners, they're not George R. R. Martin, but the showrunners just forgot about the Iron Fleet. And they've said this as much. Like, oh, right, we totally forgot about that in our rush to finish, and it just disappeared from the story. So, maybe that's weighing on my mind as I think like, well, hopefully we get the resolution of all this, or it comes to pass, and just hopefully it's not 20 books from now. Like, how long will it be?
14 books. It will be 14 books. So I think that that's actually both a really good point about what is happening in this chapter. It's just adding all of these layers and depth. But then as we're talking about, like, how do you kind of pay off things like that, I find the beginning part of this chapter to be a really interesting kind of example of that, because the second half of the chapter is all about the Aiel. It's new information. It's getting piled on. We can't really do much with it. But the early part of the chapter seems to me to be dedicated almost exclusively to Varen and wolves. And those are two things that we have had some hints at, and we have had some development. And here I almost feel like I like this early part of the chapter because it feels like a little bit more payoff, whereas the end of the chapter is all set up. So I guess I'm curious, was there anything in let's separate them. Was there anything in the wolves sections that you were especially interested in? For me, I think this is Shadow Killer without any song associated. But what was there here for you in terms of Perrin's interaction with the wolves?
It's just always fun. I want to just acknowledge that to begin with. Like, I like the wolf powers, and I like this kind of second sight he ends up having, where he's getting the intel from farther afield and can kind of inform the group and kind of pull that in. So within that, it's then very curious that the wolves are afraid of Shadow Killer. And, I immediately went to trying to identify Shadow Killer, as I'm sure you're supposed to do. And it's like, well, it doesn't quite feel to me like it can be just Pat and Fane, right? That, it feels like a darker power. And so I then went back to these, the people who showed up at the end of the last book from the city.
The Forsaken.
The Forsaken, and thinking like, oh, okay, do we actually have some Forsaken still involved here? Or is this, again, we talked about them being a surprise to Moraine, and so kind of breaking the pattern. And is that, what's there. Now, Varen's as the other part of that section, Varen's fear seems much more about Rand's fate. And so is she sensing that what Rand has been through and who Rand is with, or is she sensing the threat that Shadow Killer, faces gives to Rand? So all of that was kind of in the mix. I would say I actually wouldn't characterize it as payoff the way you did. It was enjoyable and it was interesting, but I would say it's like, oh, but it's just reminding us of the tension. It's a little bit of what I was going to say is unfair. It's not just reminding you. It is taking a step forward, but not a dramatic step forward, at least how I understood it.
Yeah, and I think for me, what's really interesting about the Varen section in particular is she is a character who at every point we have seen her so far has been very in control of the situation, even to the point of like basically convincing Siuan and Moraine to give a bunch of information to her that they otherwise wouldn't have intended to. And so I see the beginning of this chapter as being much more about Varen not knowing things than it is about worrying about Rand, but maybe that's just my inclination. I think those two things aren't mutually exclusive, right? She can be worrying about the fact that she doesn't know things and what that means for Rand. But I think this is a character who we have come to know as kind of always being on top of the situation. And I feel like maybe in addition to what you're describing, there's a little bit of that feeling we've gotten from Moraine the last time we checked in with her of how are so many things happening that I wasn't prepared for. And that's just a very different look for Varen to be in compared to what we've seen before.
I think that's right. And I had a little bit of trouble squaring that then with the way she acts, particularly in the next piece, where it's like, oh, what's this about a city? That was much more like a curiosity, like, oh, I want to go see the world and learn about this thing. And it was like, well, wait, aren't you just preoccupied and worried about what's going on here? And so kind of naturally it was like, well, does she see that as a resource or a solution to these problems? And I really don't think that's it. I think this is much more like, she was really worried, and maybe it was just the novelty of having an Aiel show up that shifted her mind out of that for the moment. I also just want to say, as we were talking about this early section, like it's clear Matt is worse and getting worse, and that's maybe the part that feels like the previously on, just to remind you that while it's interesting that Rand is bopping around and meeting Tom, it's like, no, there's a ticking clock, and his friend's life is at stake, and there's no guarantee even once they get him the dagger that he'll actually recover. So tick tick.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that other than excellent reminder. On the Varen point, I will just also add, it's worth noting Varen is a Brown, and Browns are scholars. And so if she gets new information, she can find out, she's immediately going to want to find out that information.
Okay.
This chapter then, I think, turns on its head when Urian shows up, and we start to just get what I find to be a really fascinating, but also really dense info dump on Aiel culture. I have like 5 mini stars here, like little details I kind of want to pull out, but I didn't have any big picture takeaways from this other than a lot of details that I found interesting. So I kind of want to let you at least initially tell me what was your response or thoughts, because I don't want to give away the important stuff, if that makes sense.
So have you seen Shaun of the Dead?
Yeah.
You remember there's a moment late in Shaun of the Dead where the party we've been following bumps into like their mirror images, and it's like some friends, and they all just like say hey as they pass. This very much felt like the moment where it's like, oh, Urian is just totally in a different story and in the middle of an important quest for him and his people, and it's just like they're bumping into each other and be like, oh, hey, oh, nice to see you, and gonna continue on. And that's certainly not to dismiss him. It was very exciting to meet an actual Aiel, and my reckless speculation is that part of why he's just passing this group is so he can go eventually encounter Rand, which would be much more interesting because he would have ways of unlocking pieces of Rand's story that we're not familiar with.
Yeah.
But I did find myself kind of quickly scribbling a lot of names. And certainly the one that seems the most important is the he who comes with the dawn, right?
Yeah.
essentially a chosen one of the Aiel people that will lead them out of the blight. And if I
out of the waste, just to be
out of the
clear.
waste.
Yes.
Sorry.
The
Okay.
blight
Out
is
of the
to the
waste.
north, the waste is to the east. Yeah.
Okay. We'll lead them out of the waste. And so, as I understand it, what we learned about previously is that the Aiel were an invading people. They almost conquered, but the Aes Sedai repelled them.
Not quite.
Okay. Help me
So,
out. Jump right in.
So the Aiel came out of the waste, but what we know is that their goal wasn't conquering. It was just to kill the king of Carrion. And when they did, they left.
Okay. So they left voluntarily. They weren't repelled. Okay. Good note. And so they have returned to the waste, and now yet they are seeking somebody to lead them out of it. And that very much feels like, hey, Aragorn, you can have this army in a mountain to go fight people. So it very much feels like, okay, so Rand is, I feel like it's not like reckless speculation if Matt and Perrin figure it out before you. And it's like, okay, so Rand can go lead the Aiel, which then that would be the second army we have sitting around waiting for one of our good friends to go pick them up. The other being Lan's army that he can raise his banners and call his army. So are we building to the battle of the five armies or some such? But it feels, if anything, my takeaway was this is a piece of the long game that we're really not going to see much more of, if any more of, in this book, but will come back later, I assume.
Yeah, and I think that feels like the right read. There's a lot of things here that I think it's really important to have in your notes or to kind of make a mental note of. But in terms of the long-term implications of Urian showing up, those are long-term implications. They're not 5-10 chapters away, or at least it certainly doesn't seem like it from this. A few things that jumped out at me. Number one, the Aiel referring to battle as the dance is both poetic and probably tells us something about how they think about battle and death. Related to that, the other one that jumped out at me was he talks a few times about how the threefold land, which is what the Aiel call the waste, he refers to the threefold land as being a test in repentance for an ancient sin of the Aiel. And obviously, we don't get any more detail than that. But the fact that there is kind of this original sin story in the Aiel culture, I think probably gives us a little bit of an indication of kind of where they're coming from and how their society is going to be thinking potentially about a variety of issues. Those are the two that jump out at me, along with just another name that I think came to mind repeatedly or was mentioned repeatedly, the city of Ruidian. Any thoughts on any of those or other small details that you pulled out and thought, oh, that was really interesting?
I wrote down all those things, so I feel very special. I also wrote down that Urian is a red shield.
Yep.
Right. And that just felt like, okay, another color set that we have to memorize and figure out their roles. And then just a stupid shout out to the fact that in our first D&D game ever, I played Uriel for a long time. And so I was like, hey, Urian, this is pretty close. And my guy was a angel. Azamar. So that was kind of fun. I was like, wait, if this reminds me of something, and I was like, oh right, I named my character after an archangel because he was an Azamar. So of everything you mentioned, I really liked Threefold Land because I was a work study in the admissions office at my college, and so I threefolded a lot of paper over the course of my 4 years to earn my tuition, and so it immediately made me think of a map, right? And it's like, is that, to me, that could be, the Threefold Land is like the size of it, or it could be almost like, instead of threefold, like the third fold, like the piece of the map nobody cares about, that in a movie they're like, oh, there's a fold here, we could pull this piece out or something. So curious to learn more about all those things, but don't have a ton of insight into any of them.
Totally. The only other big detail here, you already mentioned He Who Comes with the Dawn and the prophecy. I think that's one of the big things. The other that jumped out to me is that Urian mentions that Varen has a face that reminds him of the faces of the wise ones, and Varen's response is to be exceptionally interested. And whenever a character who we have been told repeatedly is really sharp immediately zeroes in on something, I feel like that's a pretty big hint at something we need to be thinking about. So I'm curious whether I mean, obviously right now it's just they have faces that look kind of similar, but did you have any thoughts on Baron's strong reaction, or what or how she, or what she was kind of trying to suss out in her questioning?
I read it all as surprise that there were potentially Aes Sedai or an Aes Sedai analog in
Yeah.
the Aiel. So kind of my natural reaction was like, oh, they assumed there's never been any one power in these people, and
Yeah.
yet this suggests that there is some way in which they are harnessing the power, or they have wielders of the power. And the gender politics kind of played into that as well a little bit there, because it is primarily women, but also tribal chieftains. So it's like,
Yes.
oh, this could be a little different, them the way we've seen it manifest in the continent that we're familiar with.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting example of gender politics among the Aiel is we get this reference to the wise ones go to Ruidian, and then clan chiefs also do. So there's a little bit of that like gender mixing as you're describing. But then we also get the detail that when Urian asks whether or not Varen will kill him with his lightnings, which is just a funny question. She says, like, no. And he goes, okay, because I would never hurt you. You're a woman and you're not a maiden of the spear. And that is interesting for two reasons. One is because we learned that the Aiel don't typically use women in battle, as we in the next chapter learn the Seanchan do. But there is at least one organization that seemingly does allow women to enter battle in among Aiel culture. So they seem to have a little bit more of essentially a balanced gender dynamic, whereas I think we've seen in Andor and Carrion and many of these other places, Jordan is kind of playing around with there is a dominant gender, but it's not always male. And so the fact that we see something where there's maybe a little bit more balance to the genders among the Aiel, I think both highlights how different that is from the rest of the world. And, this is a book where people's gender directly dictates what they can do with magic. So gender relations we should probably pay attention to.
Doesn't matter how many times you tell me the name of this continent. I'm like, yes, we're talking about Andor. And then I'm like, oh, right. This Andor, not Star Wars Andor. No, but to take your point seriously for what it is, I think that is a clear marker that this culture is different. And if we're going to mark that, it also is a reminder that Rand, as somebody from this culture or with a tie to this culture, is at the moment struggling against the fact that he's afraid of the dominant gender. And if he has a model for how the genders could mix or get closer to parity, then he would probably take it, right? And try to free himself from the burden. So again, it just feels like long-term, piece placement so that we can have these all come together later. And that's exciting. And, I joked when you introduced me, but it's like, as we've kind of realized both that this podcast will continue and that the books we'll continue to go through the books, that stuff has gone from like, we'll see, to more like, okay, I'm really excited to see long term how that comes to play. So I do have enthusiasm despite my earlier joke.
I had no doubt that you have enthusiasm in that you are here on a night after teaching. That takes some effort. Unless you have any last thoughts, I suggest we dive straight into what is kind of the meat of the reading for this week, chapter 29, Seanchan. So we begin with Joffrey Bornhald, one of the commanders of the Children of the Light, and he is dismayed that his army has been scattered to the degree that it has. He thinks that he has like squads all over the country, but he has been ordered to follow the orders of the questioners, and they have told him to do it, so he does. He arrives in a village and is shocked to find that there are a number of people who have been hung, including apparently a decent number of children. And when he tries to figure out who did this, whether it was the Seanchan or raiders or someone else, he is told not only was it White Cloaks who did it, but actually a few of the White Cloaks from his squad clearly were involved under orders from the questioners. At this point, Bornhald is basically trying to get more information, figure out what is going on. And so he asks someone to bring him one of the villagers and basically get him scared enough he thinks he is going to be tortured. At this point, we learn a decent amount about the Seanchan. Bornhald says that he has heard rumors that they use the Aes Sedai in battle, that they have many names for themselves, including the Return and the Rygal and the Karen. And then he also learns that he has been ordered to turn away from Toman Head and the village of Falme. Finally, Child Buyer, who we have met in the previous book, arrives with the individual from the village, and the chapter ends with basically Bornhald being creepy and he gets the person to say stuff, but we don't hear what they say. The other big takeaway here is that Bornhald basically declares to Buyer that he is intending to go to Falme, even if it means ignoring his orders. We then switch perspective to that of Bail Domon, the ship captain, who we have met in a couple of books now. He is fleeing from a ship of what he refers to as the Strangers, but it soon becomes apparent are the Seanchan. He tries to get his ship into the shallows, but as he starts making his way there, a few columns of flame erupt in front of his ship, and so he comes to a stop, knowing that his options are die or don't. He is soon boarded. He is a little bit kind of, it seems like, really almost upset or distraught that there are female soldiers among the Seanchan. And then he sees a pair of women, one of whom is wearing a dress with lightning bolts on it and is connected by a silver chain to another woman wearing a collar. He then meets the captain of the Seanchan, a woman named Egyanin, and she basically tells him, one, that is my damane, she is my property, referring to the woman who is collared. It becomes very quickly apparent that the collared person can channel, and Domon basically consents to have his ship searched and then taken to Falme, where hopefully he will have the opportunity to kind of talk his way out of this and leave. We then get a brief description of his trip to Falme, mostly him trying to convince one of the soldiers to give him any information about Seanchan, and him basically being told, no, that's not the business of anyone who isn't of the blood. Finally, they arrive in Falme. His ship is searched and apparently is being searched by at least one damane. He is then taken by Egyanin to see the leader, apparently, of the area, someone named High Lord Turok. Initially, he is brought to see Turok, and both he and Egyanin prostrate themselves, and it's clear that there is an enormous amount of deference given to High Lords. Egyanin then gives the piece of Quendiar that Bail Domon had, potentially one of the seals to the Dark One's prison, to Turok. Egyanin then leaves, and then Turok and Bail have a brief conversation in which it becomes apparent that Bail is in over his head. Turok is an absolute jerk, and the chapter ends with Bail basically saying, I am going to lie my way out of this, and we hope that he does because he's fun. This is a chapter that is not compact, and yet an enormous amount still happens. What are your thoughts on the overall kind of placement of this chapter, in that, to me at least, it feels like really late in the book to be introducing something this major, and yet we've had enough hints of Falme, it also doesn't feel out of left field. So what was your take on what I see as a chapter that really kind of broadens the scope of the book in a way that we really hadn't so far?
Staggeringly slow. I completely agree with that characterization. It's like, oh, maybe this is what this book is really about, or what the next few books will really be about. Because, you know, we've had all these hints about Toman's Head, and I am going to try to avoid penis jokes, but Toman's Head is a long, narrow peninsula, and on the map, Falme is a big circle right at the tip of that long peninsula. I was like, wow, we're not even being subtle here.
No.
But I mean, it's the old joke about how every Dungeons and Dragons map actually looks like a penis if you turn it in one direction. So
we had a running joke on my debate team in college where if anyone called something phallic, our response is anything that's not a square is phallic. If it's longer than it is wide, that counts.
Yeah, there it is. Kind of more on the experience of reading, I will say I found the first half of this, they're not really halves, but the first part of this I found really baffling. And part of that is a weaker attachment to Jephram, and kind of trying to struggle to remember who he was and who he's affiliated with. while getting lots of layers mixed into that section.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is kind of more attachment to Donin or just a simpler structure, but I found the second half much more readable. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm getting this much more after having struggled with the first part. But certainly a big thing. I actually when you were giving the first summary, I checked my reading app, and we are 58% through this book at the end of this chapter. So while you're saying it's late in the book, it is just past halfway. So there's a lot of pages left, but my immediate reaction was like, yeah, this is set up for maybe something climactic next book. But
Interesting.
Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean,
So
but I don't know.
Many of our listeners probably know. While I agree with you, it is the less effective section. I think in the name of chronology, we should probably begin with the White Cloak section. You said it was kind of, I forget what the term you used, whether it was like overwhelming or just a lot. The phrase that immediately comes to me is this is just a dark section of this book. We start with multiple children on a gibbet, and that is not a great image. So
no.
I think this is a very interesting section then, because it puts us in a villain's head, or at least a character who was a villain in the last book. And then it tells us, oh, no, they're not even the bad guy in their own organization. And so I'm curious what your thoughts were on just kind of the extreme methods that we see the White Cloaks taking. We knew they were bad people. We knew they tortured people sometimes, but I feel like the questioners take it to a whole nother level in this section of the chapter.
Yeah, and I think part of what I struggled with is it's like, okay, so we have general white cloaks, we have questioners, we have Jephram, and in the mix of all of that in the back of my head is, they keep referring to orders, and I keep going, well, who's giving those orders?
Yeah.
And are they actually giving the appropriate orders, or is this an infiltration of some of those people from the prologue to the book?
I was going to say, and in fact, it is worth noting in the prologue, we learned that Bors, the character we were following, had a white cloak with a shepherd's crook on it, which is a questioner. So if we are saying who are the orders coming from, if they're coming from questioners, one of them is Bors. It might not be this one, but someone in that organization is definitely a mole.
Okay, well, I'm giving myself a pat on the back for remembering that link. All these 68 or 58% of the book later that I remembered that link. And I think that kind of mix of I'm trying to learn the layers and who's ordering who and that, plus like if this is functioning properly or being manipulated. I think that's the combination that really made this feel overwhelming. But I certainly don't disagree that it's dark, and it's I think it is very much like you haven't experienced real evil yet, which is really surprising because I don't yet understand the real evil I've been tracking, the guy in the dreams. And it's like, how, or is he even connected to the Seanchan? I think that to me was kind of like, ooh, like, and that's where I would go back to the Game of Thrones comparison. It's like, Daenerys wants to kill everybody we've met on this continent, but spoiler, the White Walkers are coming and they don't even care about Daenerys, right? Like, and it very much felt like I would put Seanchan in the position of the White Walkers, like like incredibly the White Walkers aren't organized per se, but like an overwhelming force, a force of nature essentially, that are going to be unstoppable unless all the other people that cannot possibly get along learn to get along real fast.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is one of the interesting things about this chapter is that it gives us a really great glimpse at what we think are the big dark villains, and then it tells us, oh no, like they at least aren't slavers.
Yeah.
So to me, what is really interesting in this early section is that we get two characters, Bornhald, who seems pretty dark, but at least better than the questioners. And then to me, the more interesting character, Child Buyer, who we have met earlier. And in this section, it becomes apparent he is the kind of evil that is not actively evil. He is the kind of evil who will just accept the excuses from whatever evil person tells him to do bad things. And that's almost scarier. So I don't know whether you were also chilled to the bone by Child Buyer saying something along the lines of, well, of course they deserved it. Even if someone sinned 10 generations ago, that's bad enough.
Mm.
Oof.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but it's like certainly in our current moment when we're thinking about morality and fascists like around the
Yeah.
world, it's like, there's something that kind of rang familiar about like a purity test taken to the extreme,
Yeah.
right? And obviously there's nothing that grim going on right now, but it's like it's certainly a familiar trope in fantasy as well, right? That you have this, just lawful evil to the extreme. And I'm curious to see how that then will come up against seemingly a kind of chaotic evil enemy of the Seanchan. I
Yeah,
keep
and I
wanting to say Shang-Chi every time. Every time we're saying Seanchan.
that's fair. I have very little else to say about the White Cloaks other than to say I think you're exactly right. At this point, we have kind of three very dark forces. We have the Seanchan, we have the White Cloaks, and then we just have the Dark One. And
Mm.
so I think if we're talking about kind of lining up all the different types of evil, we're starting to assemble a pretty good set in this chapter. As we move on to the Seanchan themselves, to me, the first thing that needs to be addressed is the existence of Damane, right? We now have a culture that instead of saying men go crazy, women can use the power, no problem, they say men go crazy, let's enslave the women.
Mm.
And that doesn't sound fun. uh, So I guess I'm just curious, what was your initial reaction on kind of seeing our first real sketch of this culture? We get a couple of hints of like people said this and people are lighting on fire and there's monsters and whatever. But Bail Domon, this is the first time we actually see interaction with people from the Seanchan. What was your takeaway?
Well, my first reaction is I've told the podcast previously, I've been slowly working my way through the Master and Commander books. So when the ship battle started, I was like, oh, I know this. Like I've been reading a lot of this. I understand this. And it actually it was a really fun little chase and battle. And it made me think somebody should do like a pure fantasy like ship thing. Like
Yeah.
I just don't know. I think ships are often present in fantasy, but to do like the Napoleonic Wars, but actually in a fantasy realm would be really fun. So write that down for your next campaign, Dungeon Master.
Naomi Novik actually does an excellent version of this where it is
Ooh.
dragon ships.
Okay. All right. I'll look that up. So to the real question then, it's like, yes, this is, I mean, from the second they appear, they're overwhelming. And I think,
Yeah.
That's clearly the emotion Robert Jordan wants me to feel is that there is no stopping them. They have been long prepared for this and they are ready to rule. And so in that context, the Damani is, I think, a real indication that not even the Aes Sedai can save you.
Yeah.
And again, my mind is like, well, the Aes Sedai have been working on a totally different problem, and it's like no sense that they even see this threat coming in a real way. I know there were some prophecies that they were looking up to see different things. And I think Toman's Head at least was mentioned when we saw Moraine with the scholars locked away in their cottage. But it's like, I don't think they're at all prepared for the size of this threat. And, jokes from the last chapter's discussion aside, like nobody has an army ready to do this, right?
Yeah.
Like at least at this moment. And I see very little that's going to prevent them from walking up the dong of this continent and just taking over the entirety of it. And the way in which the people of Falme, and I know we're jumping around a little in this section, the way that they just immediately sign on, take the oath, and then are totally subservient just says to me that it's going to be easy for them to control large swaths of this continent.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we start to get kind of our first glimpses at how the Seanchan handle conquest, I think this actually leads to an interesting question that I want to pose to you, even though I know the answer. We have so far identified, we think Andor feels very like England, like the Shire kind of thing. We have said Carrion feels like France. Any guesses on where the Seanchan fit into our real world allegory?
I mean, the helmet design, as we said, has an Eastern influence. And it also just reminds me, actually, both Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings have like, and we'll see what's to the east, to the west, rather. Both, I think it's the west in both cases, like what's off the continent. Game of Thrones defines the east.
That's correct.
At the very end, Arya heads west.
Yeah.
And the elves are going west in Tolkien. And so it's very much like, well, if we from our familiar kind of Eurocentric kingdom here go west, we would not get to China immediately. There's the United States there, but I think it's an Eastern culture of some kind based on that and the presence of that. What complicates that is it is Arthur Hawking's people who left, and that's harder to square, right? I mean, I guess that could be America. Like, yes, the British came over here and killed and murdered and raped and then went back. So, I think it doesn't feel like it's going for America here. It feels like it's going more Eastern to me. Oof.
America.
Well, America. That's it. All right.
Cool. I'm sorry. We have an imperialist, slavery-driven nation that, if you look at the way they describe the accent, it's a Southern accent.
Really? Okay. Yeah. I totally missed that. So now, because I just embarrassed myself, I want to embarrass you back. I just sent a text, and our friend Ben responded with an impression of you on this podcast, which is, it looks like he's been questioning you for 24 hours. And when she said Rand was riding a horse named Cupcake, did that remind you of anything? I can't say any more, but it will be important 6,000 pages from now. And that made me laugh so hard. So now we're even. But
perfect.
It is that kind of thing. So maybe it was the Eastern influence of the icon that threw me a little bit. So okay. So Arthur Hawkins, it's just that literal. Arthur Hawkins people went across the sea and they're coming back now.
Yep. That's what I got for you. Yep.
Europe. Cool. Okay. I can deal with that.
And obviously Robert Jordan is a master of this is 40% America and 5% Japan and 5% everything else, right? But if we're going to talk about the imperialist jerks in the story, let's just immediately jump to America. That seems like a reasonable place. And I'm backed up by Michael Livingston on this one. I just want to be clear. The scholars agree with me. Other than the Southern accent showing up, my biggest shock in this chapter is when what appears to be a Grom shows up, because those were only in the alternate world as far as I was aware. So did you catch that there was a Grom, or what was your take on monsters among the Seanchan?
I did not catch that the horse's name was Cupcake. Tell me more about the Grom.
Yeah, so I mean, we've got a three-eyed frog bear, and Rand has already killed some three-eyed frog bears, and this is our first indication that Mirror World wasn't just showing crazy alternate creatures. It was actually showing something that is real in our world as well, if you will.
So perhaps not where it is in this world, but exists on this plane of reality, as it may be. And I actually meant to mention that underworld place when we were talking about the threefold land, because it also makes me think about that, right? That, when is it possible that, when we fold the land, that's when the planes cross each other, right? It seems like an easy metaphor there to connect into that. So are those, do they just exist across the sea, or are they perhaps being brought from the underworld? How that would then raise this foreign imperialist power to a higher level than this continent, it would seem, if they can go to there and harvest creatures or harvest weapons. It also, again, I think one of the things in Lord of the Rings that is very effectively done in the films is that the armies show up not just as armies of orcs, but with monstrous creatures for every task and what they're doing. And I think the more you make something seem otherworldly, it seems scarier, and that's like the silliest insight ever, but it makes it scarier and it makes it feel more demonic and dark. So
Well, and I actually want to tie that into something that you had mentioned earlier, which is the citizens that Bail Domon encounters and is like, why aren't you rebelling? And they're like, oh, they'll murder me with a frog bear and a woman who can light me on fire with her mind. And I
Yeah.
think you're exactly right to highlight just for, I think you're right on a military scale. That is extra intimidating and scary. And in Lord of the Rings, it gives it that extra oomph. But imagine not being the soldier fighting that, but just like a guy looking to farm some Brussels sprouts. Like that is horrifying. And it's very clear that the Seanchan know how much fear they instill and they're willing to use it.
Well, and every time we've been traveling across this continent and we've met quote unquote normal people, it's like they really don't care. And there's that's a familiar kind of thing in fantasy that's like, yeah, the elites are having their battle. I mean, this is not really elites so much as it's okay, I'm afraid of them, but if they'll just let me farm my Brussels sprouts, I'm just gonna do that. And I'll bow to them when they ask me to, or what have you. I'll pay the tariff, I'll pay the tax. Like, and it feels like, we haven't had that many kind of profiles of people like that. Actually, Donan is kind of a normal dude, or so it has seemed so far. But there's something that feels a little special about him. Like, I'm trying to build him up in my mind to be like the Onion Knight, or even like a Han Solo type, like a cool guy with a ship. But so he doesn't feel that normal either. So then, like, in all the scales of this and all the layers we've peeled back, like if you go all the way back down to this guy who, could be shepherding sheep in Two Rivers, it's like, yeah, none of this matters to him if he can just swear his fealty and be left alone. So interesting to ponder.
Yeah, and I think as we're kind of pondering where does Bail Domon fit in that spectrum, right? How normal is he versus how heroic versus what have you? This feels to me, I think the last time we checked in with Bail Domon when he was still on the other side of the continent, you mentioned that it kind of felt like a promotion for him in terms of just like our perception as readers, now that he was getting full chapters of POV. Well, here, I feel like there's a really interesting transition of Bail Domon from ordinary guy all the way up to best friend of the High Lord. And Bail Domon clearly seems kind of overwhelmed by that, but it's a really interesting way, I think, of highlighting the way that the Seanchan nobility act. Because we take Bail Domon, who, as you say, is kind of in between that regular guy versus experience spectrum. And we have someone who knows a little bit about like politics and nobility and what's normal. And so we're able to get what is happening with the Seanchan is both different from what we have on the main continent and potentially like something that is just unfamiliar to Bail, even though he seems fairly well educated. So I was curious, there's a lot of kind of like ritual throughout this chapter, it seems like, from the Seanchan. Was there anything in that jumped out at you? Or I think the thing that jumped out to me was Bail Domon just being like, this is ridiculous. I am not kissing the ground. And that kind of reaction to that, I think also tells us a lot about the two cultures and how they contrast each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think overwhelmingly the sense we get from the Seanchan is just everything is hierarchical, and it felt like we were building up to the High Lord, and then it's we get to that, and it's like, oh, but there's also an Empress. So it's like, oh, everything is pointed upwards and flows upwards. The oaths, the fealty, the supplication, all of that points higher and higher. I do think that the way you just positioned Bail Doman is that he is the kind of Han Solo, like, yeah, I'm not in this for your revolution, sweetheart, right? And I think it feels like that gap is going to devastate the continent, right? Like, because I don't want to live in that kind of society, but guess what? They are efficient at what they do, and we're getting a stronger sense of this. And if you have everybody giving an undying oath, Caharan comes to mind, where it's like everybody's fighting with each other and pushing each other down. That is not going to survive if the Seanchan get over there. Sorry, the Seanchan get over there. And it's just, again, fascism versus the messiness of democracy so readily on the surface of that.
Yeah.
I think the last piece of this, and I think it's related to that, to what you're discussing. The really curious thing I thought about the High Lord is that he says he's a collector of the symbols, right? That anything that has the black and white cookie design, he collects and has looked for many versions of it. Go for it.
Almost. So
Okay. All right.
So the Dark One seals are black and white cookies made of a substance called Quendiar. What Turok collects is not the symbol, it is the substance that the seals are made of. So he likely doesn't have a bunch of black and white cookies. He has a bunch of other things that are made of the same material, that unbreakable substance that the Dark One seals are made of. But yeah, so he's got this collection of kind of ancient artifacts of one kind or another, maybe not directly related to the dark and light in the way that you're thinking, but in terms of like an obsession with the past or with history, I think it tells us something about how the Seanchan nobility position themselves in terms of what they want and what they like, right? We get two characters here. We get Turok, he brags about his Quendiar, and we get Aiel, who brags about her Damane. So it seems like ownership, and particular ownership of things related to the power, seem like they're really important to the Seanchan.
Oh yeah, totally un-American. America does nothing like that. Sorry, did you say something? Economist Tyler Orm? Sorry.
Yeah, that's fair. I actually found the reintroduction of the seal to be really effective, because if we think back to the last time that we read about Bail Domon, it was a series of people trying to offer him exorbitant amounts of money to trap him so they could get the seal. And so the fact that we spend this entire chapter ignoring what was the motivation the previous time we saw the character until the very end when it slips out of his hands, I feel like that works really well to have you kind of everyone who's reading the book at the same time. It's like, oh, no. Okay, it's gone.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, first reader here, it was like I'd forgotten that. Right. And then it was like, as soon as that came out, it was like, oh, right. Like, oh, no. Like, oh, shit. Like, this is really troublesome, and it's going to lead to trouble. And that just made the last twist so delicious, where he's like, and now I'm gonna have to lie my way out of this, and that is endearing, and maybe why I want to think of this guy as the kind of cocky smuggler type.
Also he's a cocky smuggler.
Yeah. So he literally had this item smuggled and hidden. So I think that I guess, if the last chapter was a promotion, this was less a promotion, just like made him so endearing. And it's like, yeah, I want to spend more time with him. I'll be excited next time I see his name pop up on a chapter. So that is effective. And that I think that's what these fantasy novel series require, is you have to make every character so interesting that when we get back to them and when we're away from them, we miss them when they're away, and then we're excited when they get back, right?
Yeah.
It's the Simpsons thing. Whenever Poochie's not on screen, everybody should be asking, where's Poochie? And it's like, yeah, that's how I feel about it. An increasing number of these different strands of.
Well, and I think that this is why the second half of this book I like so much more than the first, because the first book is like, you will read about Rand and others. And then in the second half, we actually get these really great character portraits. We're spending a little more time in Perrin's Head and Egwene's. And I just think it's able to do exactly what you're describing. There is no way I am going to read 15 books all from Rand's POV. But if I care about a dozen characters in the series, it's much easier to say, okay, let's dedicate, 50, 100 pages to each of them, and suddenly we've got a big old good fantasy novel. And I think that just works better than the single character track that we had been on before. This obviously brings us chronologically to the end of the chapter, but there is so much Seanchan that we skimmed over. I'm curious if you had any last little details or things that jumped out at you, any kind of things that you were planning on mentioning that didn't come up in our kind of discussion of the chapter.
Nothing that didn't get mentioned at all, but we talked, you mentioned how ritualistic everything is, and I mentioned the oaths in passing, but it felt to me that the oaths carried higher weight than just kind of standard, like, I promise you this. That there was, obviously this is central to the culture, but also that there might be something more supernatural kind of binding there of some kind that might be revealed later, kind of felt like.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm going to butcher the name, Captain Engelonen. The
Egianin.
Egianin.
And I'm probably butchering that too. Don't get me wrong.
I don't
not
think
on
I
the
could show
TV
you.
show.
For some reason, my handwriting on these particular notes is terrible. Up above, I thought this said channel power, and I was like, "Oh, I think I said channeling the power." Anyway, so I think they've gotten a little short shrift on their kind of presence in this chapter, but I think it's very effective to make somebody come on the scene and seem so monstrous, and then also immediately cut them down and be like, but they supplicate to this force. And so that was just well done and really enjoyable to read through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if we're talking about oaths, the one thing that jumped out to me in that is the way that they punished the people for not following the oaths. They put a person in a cage looking over the water, and then they leave them there until they replace them with another person. They take oaths seriously, apparently.
Yeah.
That's what I have for these chapters, and I have some really excellent news for those of you listening along. 10 weeks left. We are getting to the end of this book. I'm curious, Greg. As you say, we've got about 40% of the book left. Do you have any big thoughts, predictions? Where are we going in the last 10 weeks of this podcast?
I will say I am less sure that this book will give us any sense of resolution than I was maybe at the end of the last set of chapters and I think that feels very chapter 2 to me. Again, this isn't a trilogy, but often, that's how chapter 2s work. It's like a cliffhanger. It's a part of that. Yeah. And so I think I was totally predicting our parties would all get to Toman's Head, and that would be where we kind of have the climax of this book. I think that's, again, we've gone so far that and we're nowhere near that I think that might be something that happens much later in the series, or at least in the next book. So really, I think this set of chapters is much more about pushing the narrative into the long game. And so short term, my predictions are much emptier. I think my hope is that we can at least somehow, I don't think Rand will meet back up with the rest of that party, but I hope we can pass the dagger. And I hope, maybe Rand's story will end with a resolution to him and his lady, not any of these kind of larger plots beyond that, right? I guess all of that is meant to say I am shrinking the scale of what I think will happen within this book.
I am, as always, going to leave a brief moment for people who have read these books to either judge or applaud Greg. Excellent work, everybody. So next week, we have 2 chapters. I think you said before the podcast, Greg, that they're slightly shorter, but still pretty much on par with what we've had. So this is chapter 30, Das Daimar, and chapter 31, On the Scent. And I'll be honest, there's a wolf icon, so that's usually when I get excited about weeks. So, Greg, I will allow you to take us out of the episode. But in general, 10 weeks left, and getting back in the heads of some of the main characters after a really interesting diversion.
Breaking news. You just lied.
Oh my God, I did.
On the Scent does not have a wolf. On the Scent has Cairn, right? Carrion. I'm just going to keep butchering all the names all the time. That's now my brand. Yes, finally, now I get to say something wise back at Tylor. And so we'll call the score even for the night. I think you can all tell by us being a little punchier, a little goofier, like this is getting fun and exciting again. And it's not that it ever was a drag, but when the books get better, the discussion gets better and it gets more thrilling. So we hope you're enjoying this journey as much as we are. If you are one of our faithful listeners and want to let us know that you'd like to talk about the show for an episode, we'd love to hear from you. And we've got enough room that we could grab some of you to come along on the journey if you want to step up to the mic. And maybe you will, maybe you won't, but we will all find out next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass, and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.